Tokyo, May 1942. The air was still, heavy with the hum of distant traffic and the faint clatter of wooden sandals. A crowd had gathered near a police compound. Ordinary citizens, office workers, mothers with children in their arms. Their eyes were fixed on a single figure. A young American pilot, hands bound but uninjured, stood beneath the midday sun. His flight suit was dusty, his face pale from exhaustion. He had fallen from the sky hours earlier, shot down after the daring Doolittle raid, the first strike that dared touch the Japanese homeland. But there were no stones thrown, no voices screaming for revenge. The people simply watched, silent and uncertain. A few whispered that he looked hardly older than their own sons. Soldiers escorted him carefully, not cruelly, as if this captured airman were more a curiosity than a criminal. Somewhere, a radio played a faint march. The empire still stood proud. Its victories filled every headline. But beneath that calm veneer, a faint tremor was beginning to build. A sense that the skies would not remain theirs forever. The Americans' capture would be remembered. Yet soon, it would be overshadowed by something far greater, far darker. When the Second World War erupted across the Pacific, Imperial Japan moved with the speed of a rising storm. Between December 1941 and the summer of 1942, the Japanese Empire stretched farther than any nation in modern history had ever expanded so quickly. From the jungles of Malaya to the coral reefs of the Philippines, the rising sun flew over territories once thought untouchable. For the Japanese people, this expansion was framed as destiny, proof of divine favor, of cultural superiority, and of the emperor's sacred mission. Every headline, every radio broadcast declared victory after victory. Civilians believed they were fighting not only to protect their homeland, but to purify Asia of Western control. And yet, far beyond Japan's shores, the United States had begun to awaken from its shock. Pearl Harbor had galvanized an industrial and military machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. By early 1942, American bombers were preparing to do what Japanese citizens were told was impossible: strike the home islands themselves. That strike came on April 18, 1942, 16 B-25. Mitchell bombers, launched from the USS Hornet under Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, roared toward Tokyo and other key targets. It was a mission designed as both revenge and message. Japan was not untouchable. The Doolittle raid caused limited physical damage, but its psychological impact was enormous. Tokyo's civilians awoke to explosions in their own neighborhoods. For the first time, the war was no longer a distant campaign fought on foreign soil. It had arrived at their doorstep. In the aftermath, several American planes ran out of fuel and crash-landed across occupied China. But a few crews were captured by Japanese forces in China and occupied territories. These men became among the first American prisoners to fall into Japanese hands after the attack. When news of captured pilots reached Japan, public curiosity outweighed hatred. Many citizens had never seen an American in person. In propaganda posters, Americans were often depicted as crude, animalistic aggressors. Yet when confronted with real human faces, doubt flickered quietly beneath the surface. Japanese authorities treated these early prisoners with a calculated restraint, at least in public view. The military's goal was to display discipline and moral superiority to its own people, an image of control, not chaos. Civilians who saw these captured flyers described them as calm, strangely polite, even ordinary. Behind the scenes, however, the military's view was far less merciful. To the Imperial High Command, these men were symbols of defiance. Some officers argued they should be executed to demonstrate Japan's resolve. Others insisted that public trials and controlled propaganda would serve a greater purpose. Still, for ordinary citizens, this restraint seemed to reflect honor. Japan's long cultural memory, shaped by centuries of samurai tradition, valued the treatment of prisoners as a reflection of one's own strength. To harm a helpless enemy dishonored the victor. It was a belief soon to be tested. As the months passed, Japan's early momentum began to slow. The Battle of Midway, fought in June 1942, dealt a staggering blow to the Imperial Navy. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were lost. Overnight, the balance of power shifted. Civilians were not told the full truth. Newspapers reported glorious victories, even as Japan's naval power was bleeding away. But rumors drifted through the ports and factories. Trains carried home fewer young men. Grain shipments grew thin. By late 1942, a quiet anxiety had taken root, a sense that the tide was turning. And yet, in the cities, life tried to maintain its rhythm. The government enforced calm through strict censorship and patriotic education. School children practiced air drills. Posters urged thrift, loyalty, and silence. Civilians were told to trust the military completely. Still, the image of that first captured American pilot lingered. A man treated gently, watched curiously by crowds who could not yet imagine what vengeance from the skies truly meant. That fragile illusion, the belief that Japan could control the war's moral ground, would begin to crack as the Allied counteroffensive grew stronger and the bombers came again. By late 1943, the atmosphere across Japan had changed. The confident calm that had marked the early war years was replaced by quiet unease. The tide of war, once flowing steadily outward, now turned back toward the islands themselves. The Imperial Army fought desperately in the jungles of Burma and New Guinea. On the seas, Japan's once proud navy faced mounting losses against the relentless advance of American carrier groups. Allied submarines began strangling Japan's supply lines, cutting off oil, rubber, and food. Yet, in the heart of Tokyo, official broadcasts still spoke of temporary setbacks. Civilians clung to the illusion that victory remained possible. Propaganda films showed smiling workers building planes, children singing patriotic songs, and soldiers returning home victorious. But the truth was harder to hide each month. The air raid drills grew more frequent. Government rationing deepened. Families learned to live on less and expect worse. In the skies, the balance of power shifted decisively. The United States introduced the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, a massive, high-altitude bomber capable of reaching Japan from distant bases. These aircraft represented the industrial might of a nation untouched by occupation or starvation. Each new raid carried the promise and the threat of greater devastation. For Japan's civilians, the first encounters with these bombers came as eerie, distant events. Sirens would wail across the night, sending families into underground shelters or flimsy wooden basements. They would emerge hours later to find distant fires burning, the horizon glowing red. It was not yet the full inferno that would come later, but it was enough to stir fear. Among the educated classes and the older generation, there was still faith in the emperor's protection, a belief that divine forces shielded the homeland. But younger citizens, factory workers, students, mothers of small children began to question. Why was the enemy growing stronger? Why did the air raid warnings now sound every week? Government censors silenced such doubts swiftly. Questioning the war effort was treasonous. Even whispers could lead to arrest. So the fear stayed quiet, locked inside homes where families bowed before portraits of the emperor, praying the next night's sirens would not be for them. At the same time, American strategy grew more precise, more ruthless. After heavy fighting in the Marianas in mid-1944, the U.S. secured airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, within striking distance of Japan's cities. From those runways, the B-29s launched with deadly regularity. The first major raid on Tokyo came in November 1944. It was surgical, aimed at factories and docks. But as weeks passed and Japan refused surrender, the strategy evolved. The new objective was not just to cripple production, it was to break the will of a nation. American planners understood that Japan's war machine was deeply intertwined with civilian infrastructure. Wooden houses, small workshops, neighborhood foundries all fed the imperial effort. In their view, destroying these targets meant hastening the war's end. For civilians, it was the beginning of a nightmare they had never imagined possible. And yet, in those same months, captured American pilots continued to arrive in Japan. Some were brought in after being shot down over the sea or over Kyushu. In certain towns, locals watched quietly as soldiers escorted them through train stations or along dirt roads. The contrast was striking. Even as Japanese cities were beginning to burn, these prisoners were often displayed as proof of Japan's discipline. Foreign enemies treated according to the rules of war. Even as the war itself grew less human by the day, civilians could not reconcile it. They were told Americans were monsters, ruthless, barbaric. But the men they saw looked no different from themselves, pale, exhausted, frightened. Still, compassion was dangerous. Some who expressed sympathy toward captured airmen were reported to the Kempeitai, the secret police. Kindness could be considered weakness. Fear had replaced curiosity. And then, by the spring of 1945, the tone of everything changed. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe were struck in waves of incendiary attacks that erased entire districts overnight. The gentle restraint once shown to a handful of captured Americans vanished beneath clouds of fire and ash. The same citizens who once stood quietly watching a bound pilot now stood beneath burning skies, clutching their children, wondering if the mercy they once believed in had ever truly existed. The world that had treated prisoners with dignity was disappearing, and soon even the concept of mercy itself would be consumed by the flames. When the first American pilots were taken into Japanese custody, they were more symbols than soldiers. Most were survivors of downed bombers, young men in their early 20s, exhausted from days adrift at sea or from parachuting into enemy territory. To their Japanese captors, they represented both humiliation and curiosity, proof that the foreign enemy could bleed. For civilians, these airmen were living contradictions. Japan's wartime propaganda had painted Americans as immoral, undisciplined cowards who lacked honor. Yet, when Japanese guards paraded the prisoners through small towns or transported them by train, bystanders saw something different: humans, not demons. Some whispered prayers for their safety. Others simply stared in silence, unsure what emotion was allowed. A few documented accounts survive of such moments. One Japanese clerk in Tokyo later recalled watching a captured pilot pass by and feeling confused that his face was not hateful, but tired, like ours. For many, it was the first moment the war felt personal, tangible, and morally complex. But this human empathy was fragile. The military's censorship machine quickly erased any public sympathy. Citizens were reminded that these men had dropped bombs on innocent people. Kindness toward them became unpatriotic. Still, for those few who had seen the prisoners up close, the image of their vulnerability never entirely vanished. It lingered like a quiet question beneath the roar of warplanes. Within the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, captured airmen were treated as rare sources of intelligence. Japan's interrogation units, particularly the feared Kempeitai, sought to extract information on Allied flight patterns, technologies, and strategies. Yet, early in the war, Japanese officers were often perplexed by how little their prisoners revealed. American pilots had been trained to give only name, rank, and serial number. For Japanese interrogators steeped in the Bushido ethos of absolute loyalty and sacrifice, this silence was incomprehensible. To them, surrender itself was shameful. In Japanese military culture, to be captured alive was dishonor. They could not understand how the enemy accepted it calmly, even dutifully. One captured American officer later recalled a Japanese interrogator shouting in disbelief, "Why do you live when your comrades die?" This cultural gap defined much of the early prisoner treatment. Some officers viewed humane handling as a sign of superiority, proof that Japan could demonstrate moral control. Others saw mercy as weakness. The result was inconsistency. Some prisoners were treated decently in camps, even receiving medical care. Others faced brutal interrogations and eventual execution, particularly those accused of attacking civilians. Discipline among guards varied by region and by command. In major cities where civilians could witness behavior, the army maintained a facade of order. In isolated military compounds, unseen by the public, darker realities unfolded. But tactically, Japan understood one thing well: the image of controlled authority mattered. The world, and more importantly, its own people, needed to believe that Japan conducted itself with dignity, even as total war stripped that. Dignity from both sides. At the heart of Japan's treatment of captured Americans lay a profound internal conflict. The struggle between the old warrior code and the modern demands of a mechanized war. The Bushido ideal, loyalty, courage, self-sacrifice had shaped Japan's military for centuries. Soldiers were taught that surrender was worse than death. To die in service of the emperor was not tragedy. It was duty. This worldview made it nearly impossible for many Japanese to empathize with captured enemies. Yet the government needed to maintain order among its own civilians. Public executions of captured Americans risked revealing desperation. Instead, the state crafted an image of calm strength, showing prisoners alive, guarded, but unharmed. For civilians, this created moral dissonance. If surrender was shameful, why were these Americans allowed to live? If mercy was weakness, why did Japan appear merciful? The contradiction gnawed quietly at the national psyche. Behind closed doors, the contradiction also affected Japanese soldiers themselves. Some guards reportedly offered cigarettes or food to prisoners, small gestures that defied indoctrination. Others, conditioned by years of propaganda and battlefield rage, viewed the Americans as less than human. The psychological divide widened further as the war turned against Japan. When Allied bombers began targeting cities, empathy evaporated. The very sight of an American face became a reminder of death from the sky. Still, in the early years, before the firebombs, before the atomic clouds, Japan's society stood on a narrow moral line. It saw its enemies through two conflicting lenses: human curiosity and national hatred. Both could not coexist forever. And when that balance finally broke, the consequences would be catastrophic. In wartime Japan, information was as tightly controlled as ammunition. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and film reels all served a single purpose: to shape how the public saw the world, and especially the enemy. When American pilots were first captured, Japan's propaganda ministry recognized a rare opportunity. Photographs of restrained, unharmed prisoners were quietly circulated in select publications, not to evoke sympathy, but to project strength. The message was subtle but clear. Japan was a disciplined empire, guided by principle, unlike the chaotic democracies of the West. In Tokyo's theaters, newsreels narrated scenes of captured Americans with calm detachment. Even in victory, the announcers would say, "Our imperial soldiers uphold honor." To an audience raised on reverence for the emperor and the samurai ideal, this imagery reinforced the myth of moral superiority. But this facade came at a cost. The more Japan emphasized control and civility, the deeper the eventual shock would be when the war's brutality reached their own homes. Civilians believed their enemies were being handled fairly. They could not imagine that some of those same prisoners were being interrogated, starved, or executed elsewhere. Propaganda was a mirror that reflected only what the state wished its people to see. It allowed the illusion of righteousness to survive. even as the walls around it began to crack. When the bombers came, and cities burned under American fire, the propaganda machine could no longer maintain coherence. The image of calm control collapsed into images of chaos and loss. What had once been a story of superiority turned into a story of survival. To understand Japan's wartime psyche, one must understand the invisible weight of honor. In a society where obedience to authority was sacred, the concept of surrender carried a stigma older than the nation itself. Children were taught that dying for the emperor was the highest virtue. In schools, teachers recited patriotic poems that celebrated self-sacrifice. Soldiers swore oaths of loyalty that demanded death over capture. This mindset shaped how civilians viewed both their own soldiers and the enemy's. When Japanese families heard of their sons dying in far-off islands, they found comfort in believing those deaths were noble. But when they saw captured Americans treated with restraint, confusion stirred. How could the enemy live when Japan's own refused to? The contradiction grew painful as air raids intensified. Entire neighborhoods were incinerated. Tens of thousands perished in single nights. Civilians who once admired Japan's honorable restraint now wondered whether mercy had been a mistake. Some began to see compassion itself as dangerous, an indulgence their suffering no longer allowed. Yet in quiet corners of bombed cities, the humanity that had once greeted those early prisoners survived in whispers. Neighbors shared rice with homeless strangers. Women carried water to dying soldiers. Amid the ruins, compassion returned, not for the enemy, but for one another. The war had shattered the moral hierarchy that once justified cruelty. In its place, only shared suffering remained. Inside the imperial military, the tension between image and reality became unsustainable. By 1944, with defeats mounting and supply lines cut, Japan's armed forces began to fracture under pressure. Officers debated how to handle new waves of captured American pilots, especially those accused of bombing civilians. Hardliners within the Kempeitai demanded execution, revenge for the firestorms that consumed Tokyo and Nagoya. Moderates argued that discipline and international law must still apply, but the voice of restraint was fading. Some commanders, desperate to preserve morale, carried out unauthorized killings of prisoners. Others continued to parade captured airmen before towns, using them as proof that Japan still maintained order. It was a paradox, public mercy masking private brutality. In the closing months of the war, as American B-29s reduced cities to ash, discipline broke entirely in some regions. Local garrisons acted on emotion, not orders. When one B-29 was shot down near Kyushu, surviving crew members were beaten and executed by enraged soldiers, news that never reached the public. The collapse of control mirrored the collapse of the empire itself. The Japan that had once prided itself on moral restraint now fought only for survival. By mid-1945, the gulf between propaganda and experience was total. Civilians who had once seen captured Americans as curiosities now saw the Americans only as shapes in the night sky, planes that carried death, fire, and the approaching end of everything they knew. The illusions of mercy, honor, and restraint were gone. What remained was the raw, unfiltered reality of total war. And soon, in that desperate final summer, Japan would face the moment that ended not only the war, but an entire way of seeing the world. It began quietly. Just after midnight on March 10, 1945, the sound of engines rolled over Tokyo like distant thunder. At first, many thought it was another reconnaissance flight, the kind they had grown used to. But within minutes, the hum deepened into a storm. Hundreds of aircraft, moving in formation, unseen above the clouds. These were B-29 superfortresses, 334 of them, launched from the Mariana Islands under the command of General Curtis LeMay. Each carried thousands of pounds of incendiary bombs filled with napalm and white phosphorus. The mission was simple, brutal, and final: to erase Tokyo's industrial base by burning the city itself. In the wooden neighborhoods of eastern Tokyo, families woke to sirens that screamed too late. Blackouts had become routine, and many ignored the first warnings. Then the first bombs fell. What followed was not battle. It was annihilation. A single B-29 pass set entire districts ablaze. The fuel-thickened fire clung to wood, paper, even skin. The wind, driven by the heat, turned narrow alleys into tunnels of flame. People ran for the rivers, but even the Sumida boiled. Mothers threw children into the water to escape the heat, only to dive in after them. Within hours, 16 square miles of Tokyo were gone. Nearly 100,000 civilians died that night, more than at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. For those who survived, the city they had known was unrecognizable: a black ocean of ash, twisted metal, and silence. And amid that silence, the illusion broke. The same civilians who had once watched captured American pilots with restrained curiosity now saw those pilots' countrymen as faceless harbingers of fire. The humanity once glimpsed in a prisoner's face had vanished beneath the roar of the engines. Yet beneath the surface, a darker realization took hold. Some civilians remembered how gently those captured pilots had once been treated. The order, the calm, the strange civility. Now, under the fiery sky, many wondered if that mercy had ever mattered. In a single night, Japan's sense of moral control was burned away. The enemy no longer came as a man. He came as a force of nature. For the Americans above, the mission was seen as grim necessity. After years of war, the logic of compassion had been replaced by arithmetic: targets, tonnage, and destruction per square mile. Each crew saw only glowing patterns through the bomb sight. They did not hear the screams or smell the burning air. From their perspective, this was the path to peace, the only way to force Japan's surrender without a costly invasion. For the people below, it was the end of the world. When dawn came, the rising sun illuminated nothing but ruin. Fire brigades dragged hoses through molten streets. Families searched for faces in the ashes. Even those untouched by the flames felt the weight of defeat. The emperor's divine protection had failed. Across the nation, other cities awaited the same fate. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe. Each would burn in turn, each a step closer to surrender, and to something still unimaginable. In military command centers, officers stared at maps filled with red circles, each marking a destroyed city. The war had lost all meaning except endurance. The Bushido Code, the samurai ideal, the propaganda of moral strength, all had turned to dust. Still, broadcasts continued. "Our spirit remains unbroken," they declared. But in the shelters and ruins, people whispered the truth: the war was lost. For months, the bombers came again and again. Daylight raids by hundreds of B-29s reduced factories, rail lines, and ports to rubble. The night raids finished what the daylight missed. By July 1945, Japan's cities were skeletons. Nearly 40% of Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya had been destroyed. In rural towns, refugees wandered among burned fields, telling stories of the sky catching fire. And then, in early August, a rumor spread. A single bomb had destroyed an entire city. The name was whispered with disbelief: Hiroshima. The world had entered a new phase of destruction, one that even war-hardened minds could not yet comprehend. Japan had seen cruelty, but nothing could prepare it for what was coming next. A light brighter than the sun, and a silence deeper than any before. Dawn. August 6, 1945. The air over Hiroshima was warm, almost serene. Students swept the streets for debris. Soldiers loaded supplies. The war, though distant, still lingered in the rhythm of daily life. Sirens had sounded at sunrise, but were soon silenced. Just another false alarm, people thought. At 8:15 a.m., a lone silver plane glinted high above the city. Few looked up. It was the Enola Gay, a Boeing B-29 flown by Colonel Paul Tibbets. Inside its belly rested a single bomb unlike any ever used before. Little Boy. 43 seconds after release, it detonated. A blinding flash swallowed the city in white light. A fireball hotter than the sun erupted, vaporizing buildings and bodies in an instant. Within seconds, Hiroshima ceased to exist. Tens of thousands were killed outright. Tens of thousands more would die in the following days from burns, shock, and radiation. Those who survived spoke of a silence so complete it felt supernatural. A stillness broken only by the crackle of fires and the distant wailing of those who could not die fast enough. In Tokyo, officials received confused reports. A new bomb, some said. A single weapon that destroyed an entire city. Many refused to believe it. The Japanese high command dismissed it as propaganda. Yet photographs, intercepted radio messages, and the stunned silence from Hiroshima told the truth. 3 days later, it happened again. August 9, 1945. Nagasaki at 11:02 a.m. Another blinding flash tore through the valley. The bomb, Fat Man, exploded above the city, flattening entire districts and killing nearly 40,000 people instantly. The blast waves echoed off the hills like thunder. Clouds of ash and flame rose higher than mountains. By evening, both Hiroshima and Nagasaki were gone. The moral shock was immediate and total. For years, Japan had believed itself guided by divine favor, its emperor the living descendant of heaven. Now, the heavens themselves had turned against them. Civilians whispered that the gods had abandoned the nation. Priests led processions through the ruins, chanting prayers for souls that had no bodies left to bury. For captured American pilots still held in prison camps across Japan, the experience was surreal. Some guards stared at them in silence for days. Fear, disbelief, and exhaustion etched into their faces. One prisoner later recalled a guard whispering, almost to himself, "It's over." In the ruins of Nagasaki, survivors wandered like ghosts. Children searched for parents who no longer existed. The air carried the taste of iron and smoke. It was said that shadows of people had been burned onto walls, frozen forever in the instant of destruction. The Japanese government, torn between pride and despair, debated surrender. Some military leaders demanded continued resistance, a final battle on the home islands. Others, staring at maps of vanished cities, knew resistance meant extinction. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio for the first time in history. His voice, calm and distant, broke through static and tears. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. It was surrender. The unthinkable had happened. For ordinary Japanese citizens, the announcement was both relief and humiliation. Years of sacrifice, millions of deaths, all for an empire reduced to ashes. For the first time, they heard their emperor speak, and for the first time, they heard defeat. In the following days, silence spread across the nation. No parades, no cries of triumph, only stunned quiet. The American planes that had once symbolized terror now flew overhead, dropping leaflets announcing the end of hostilities. For those who remembered the early years of the war, the calm capture of American pilots, the belief in Japan's unshakable honor, the contrast was unbearable. Once, Japan had prided itself on its restraint, its dignity. It had treated its first prisoners as proof of civilization. But by the end, the empire itself had been reduced to what it once claimed to transcend: raw survival amid ruin. And for the few civilians who had once looked into the eyes of those captured Americans, there remained one haunting thought. How strange that mercy had existed at all, in a war that ended with such merciless light. The Empire of Japan had entered the war, believing it could define humanity through strength. It ended the war learning that strength, without compassion, leaves only shadows. September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay. A gray morning mist clings to the water as the battleship USS Missouri looms motionless, anchored like a monument to victory. On her deck, representatives of the Allied powers stand in formation: American, British, Soviet, Australian, French, Dutch, Chinese. Before them, the delegation of the Empire of Japan steps forward in silence. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, dressed in formal mourning attire with a top hat, walks with a limp, his leg lost years earlier to a political assassin's bomb. He removes his hat, bows, and signs the instrument of surrender. Behind him, General Yoshijiro Umezu adds his signature on behalf of the Imperial Japanese Army. At exactly 9:08 a.m., World War II in the Pacific officially ends. General Douglas MacArthur steps to the microphone. His words are measured, deliberate, echoing across the deck. It is my earnest hope that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. All across Japan, people listen on crackling radios. Some weep openly, others kneel in silence. For the first time in modern history, Japan is an occupied nation. The American soldiers who now walk through Tokyo's ruins are not greeted with gunfire, but with bowed heads and silence. Civilians line the roads, exhausted, hungry, eyes hollow but calm. The streets once filled with imperial banners now hang white flags from shattered windows. In rural towns, villagers hide what little rice they have. In cities, the smell of burned wood and decay lingers. Yet amid the devastation there is no uprising, no last stand. The Japanese people, stunned by the scale of destruction, obey the surrender with quiet resignation. American troops are astonished. They had been told to expect resistance, suicide attacks, ambushes. Instead, they find order and compliance. In many cases, Japanese civilians even help direct them through the ruins. For the Allied prisoners of war, those who survived the brutal camps in Japan, Manchuria, and Southeast Asia, the surrender is a miracle almost too large to process. Emaciated men, skin clinging to bone, crawl from bamboo huts to greet soldiers of the U.S. Navy and Red Cross workers. Many had not seen a friendly face in years. Some Japanese guards bow deeply to them, whispering apologies. Others disappear into the forests, unwilling to face judgment. In Tokyo, word spreads quickly that Emperor Hirohito will not be executed. MacArthur decides to preserve him as a symbolic figure to stabilize Japan. For many Americans, the decision is controversial. For the Japanese, it feels like mercy they did not expect. In the weeks that follow, order begins to return. Rail lines reopen. Food convoys arrive. American aircraft no longer carry bombs. They drop leaflets, medicine, and chocolate bars for children. The same B-29s that had once brought destruction now deliver aid. For civilians who had once witnessed captured American pilots treated gently in the early years of the war, the irony is impossible to ignore. The same Americans, now conquerors, walk their streets with restraint, discipline, and even kindness. Children run toward them out of curiosity, not fear. Soldiers smile, share rations, and hand out chewing gum. The war that began in fire ends in gestures of quiet humanity. In many Japanese diaries from that time, one recurring theme appears: disbelief. Disbelief that the Americans they had been taught to hate could show compassion. Disbelief that those once captured pilots might now be flying above them. No longer prisoners, but victors who chose mercy instead of vengeance. The cycle had turned completely. But beneath the calm, a deeper reckoning was only beginning. A nation built on honor now faced the humiliation of defeat and the moral question that hung over every survivor. What had it all been for? And that question, unanswered and unbearable, would define the years that followed.